talk about funding the freedom dividend, at least in part through a VAT tax. Explain how that would work and how you see that impacting the economy and different classes in the economy.
The biggest winners in the 21st century economy are going to be companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Uber, and Amazon's the clearest example. Amazon's closing 30% of our stores and malls, sucking up $20 billion in value every year, and paying zero in taxes while doing it. Now, that's not their fault, that's our fault. If we've created a system that's so easy to game that $1 trillion tech company can pay zero in taxes. So if we give ourselves a tiny slice of every Amazon sale, every Google search, every Facebook ad, then we can pay for a dividend of $1,000 a month, and that's what the value-added tax is designed to do. Every other advanced economy has already figured this out.
Why do you prefer the value-added tax over, say, a wealth tax, something like what Elizabeth Warren's proposed?
Now, a wealth tax makes sense in spirit, and it even makes sense by the numbers, but in real life, the implementation would have massive problems. Wealthy people in this country are not the sort of people that are going to submit to an inventory of all their assets on an annual basis and then pay a 2% toll. You would see massive compliance problems, capital flight, and many Americans even looking at it and saying, wait a minute, if I stay here as an American, I'm going to be paying $20, $30, $40 million a year. Is my citizenship actually worth that to me? And you'd have many people actually asking themselves those questions.
So you think that wealthy Americans may move abroad if they're asked to pay more in taxes?
Part of it's paying more in taxes, but part of it is submitting to an inventory of their assets, because many wealthy Americans do not want everyone in the public to know exactly how much they have.
So here's the other critique I hear of you, sort of from the progressive left, which is that you have a kind of fatalism, right? You basically say, Amazon's taken over, this is the direction that we're heading in. Rather than being able to change that trajectory, here's the way that we can cope. Let me give you this, freedom dividend. Let me make sure that you're going to be able to make it with that inevitable reality. What do you say to that? I mean, is that fair? Do you think that's unfair?
It's an interesting critique. I mean, I look up and see the realities of the 21st century economy. We're in this winner-take-all economy, and it's just becoming more extreme. So to me, the logical thing to do is distribute the bounty to as many of us as possible, make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, improve our relationships and way of life. To me, that's a win, to see ourselves as the owners and shareholders of this country. I think that is the best way forward. And to folks who say we want to try and freeze time or forestall some of these changes, in some cases they might be right that we'd have to look at that, but I think that'd be a very difficult approach across an entire economy or society.
And do you see $1,000 a month as the starting bid, or is that the final resting place? I mean, what does the future of the freedom dividend look like, is I guess what I'm trying to ask.
Well, we have to build an economy that revolves around our own well-being. Right now, GDP is leading us off a cliff. You have GDP at record highs, also at record highs in this country, suicides, drug overdoses, stress, financial insecurity. So our measurements are all wrong. The goal has to be that we actually start to optimize around our own health and well-being, our mental health and freedom from substance abuse, clean air and clean water, how our kids are doing. And so the freedom dividend is a foundation. And then we have to build the house on top of it. And the house is an economy that actually works for us and makes us stronger and healthier.
So how does that work?
Well, the way it works, Crystal, is as your president, I go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and I say, hey, GDP, almost 100 years old, really out of date and kind of useless. What we should do is we should upgrade it and modernize it to the American scorecard that would include our health and life expectancy, mental health, and these other measurements, and then start moving the economy in that direction over time. And the freedom dividend would help lay the groundwork for that, but then we'd have to try and direct our own energies towards solving the real problems of this time, like climate change, like the mental health crisis that we're in the midst of, that so many people are experiencing around the country. If you have the wrong measurements, you will never make progress. First, we lay the foundation. Second, we get the measurements right. And then third, we start directing our energies towards solving our real problems.
Yeah. One of those real problems that you just raised is a massive addiction crisis, probably the worst in our nation's history. And you see life expectancy actually going down at the same time that, to your point, the stock market's doing great and unemployment's low and GDP is doing well. So there's clearly something wrong,
there's
sort
a
of
massive
at the core
disconnect.
of society. Specifically on the addiction crisis, how does your view of addiction differ from sort of the current regime? How would you change the way that we deal with addiction in this country?
No, it's a similar principle, Crystal, where we're excessively punitive in this country. And that if you become addicted, then somehow we're like, well, tough it out, recover on your own.
We see it as a moral failing.
Yes, we can tell it's a structural problem. And you can see that with Purdue Pharma now on the verge of bankruptcy because it's forfeiting billions of dollars in blood money. I mean, the federal government was negligent in allowing us to get to a point where you had hundreds of thousands of opiate prescriptions. You had more opiate prescriptions in the state of Ohio than people in the state of Ohio at one point. And that was on the government's watch. And then we somehow hold individuals accountable for becoming addicted when you had companies that profited to the tune of tens of billions of dollars on the backs of those addictions. And so right now we have to own up to our own government's failings and responsibility and say, look, this plague is our fault, at least in part. So we need to put the resources to work to help people get well, even though this is not a monetary problem, this is a human problem.
Right.
But then the second thing is we have to stop punishing people for becoming hooked on these drugs. We have to say, look, if you're an addict, we're going to refer you to treatment and not a prison cell. I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. I mean, does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. I mean, at this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin,
right,
which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done? Because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. I mean, is that essentially, is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites. And I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail and letting them know this. And I was inspired in part by a high school student in Iowa who said to me, his classmates have fentanyl patches on their arms, they're already addicted, what are we going to do? And I realized that those teenagers would never seek treatment because it's an illegal substance. And that if they got a criminal record, then they would think that their life could be, due for a huge change for the worse.
Yeah. On the economy writ large and sort of changing the dynamics that we have, which I know is something you're very committed to, where does the labor movement fit into that vision?
Well, the labor movement has been the foremost champion for better treatment, better hours, better benefits for workers for decades. And I looked into the genesis of the UAW. I mean, they had to fight literally with their lives on the line. But the reality is that union membership has declined from 33% in the 40s to 10% today. I mean,
and why do you think that is?
Well, it's because at this point, the market is winning. The market is saying, look, people are costs, not investments. And if you can minimize those costs, then you'll become more successful. And so businesses at every turn have tried to reduce union organization and membership, and they've been very successful. And so you've seen this massive contraction in union influence, which hopefully we can change by putting this dividend into every worker's hands. You and I are both friends with Andy Stern of the SEIU. I mean, he originated this freedom dividend plan as a way to make workers harder to push around and exploit.
Right, because money is power in this country. That's the reality. What about, would you support going further? I mean, the businesses, yes, have always wanted to crush unions, but now they've had partners with the Republicans for a number of decades, and Democrats haven't prioritized them, right? They've done lip service, and some Democrats have been openly anti-labor even over the past couple of decades. Would you actually put legislation in place, for example, to end right-to-work laws that have been passed in a lot of states in this country?
I would. The reality is that for every 10 or 100 groups of workers that want to unionize, most of them are intimidated and bullied and scared out of doing so. And a lot of this is because you have these very, very union unfriendly right-to-work laws on the books in some states. So that's something I would love to change as president.